As most of you know, this is the PCC Forum, a speaker series that our department has been running for quite a while. I'm Matt Siegel. Most of you know me already. If you're a new student and starting this semester, maybe you don't know me that well yet because I'm on sabbatical. I've been enjoying that, but I'm eager to get back to teaching in the spring. Today, we have a very special guest, Iain McGilchrist. Iain is a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, or neuroscience researcher, and a philosopher. And he's the author of a couple of very important books. Back in 2009, he published The Master and His Emissary, subtitled The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And then last year, The Matter with Things, subtitled Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. And today, I'm very grateful that Iain can join us and talk with me first for about an hour. I get him to myself to discuss his work, and then we will open it up for the final half hour or so. It's a soft ending for dialogue with everyone present today. So first of all, Iain, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for speaking with our graduate program today.
It's a huge pleasure, and I've been following your work for a couple of years and always wanted to meet you, so it was great that we met in August in California. That's and right. That we could bring off this event. Yeah.
Yes. So Iain's back at his home on the Isle of Skye, and is joining us. Most of us maybe are in California, but we do have students all over the world right now. So for me, it's 11 a.m. For Iain, it's about 7 in the evening, I think.
Yeah.
So you've written your latest book in an attempt to understand the nature of reality. Big topic, something that we in PCC are comfortable with, let's say, and excited to participate in an inquiry of that heft, that weight, that sort of gravity. But based on the title, the subtitle of your second book, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, it's immediately apparent that you don't think things are going very well at the moment. So you begin the medium of understanding itself, right? The embodied brain, and you review the rich clinical and neuroscientific literature that supports the hemisphere hypothesis. And I want to get into that with you initially to frame the rest of the discussion. But in your latest book, you do go on, of course, to explore the ways that the brain contributes to connecting us up with reality through science and reason, emotion, imagination, intuition, and so on. And you also dive into the deep end to do some scientifically but also spiritually informed speculation about the biggest metaphysical questions, the nature of space and time, matter and energy, and consciousness, including the purpose of life and the sense of the sacred. But before we get into explaining why there is something rather than nothing, and talking about the purpose of life and all of that, let's talk about the brain. I know you view it as a medium and not as an emitter or a producer of consciousness, but as a medium, you do show in great detail how damage to certain parts of the brain can degrade or transform our consciousness or particular features of our consciousness. So to get started here, can you speak to both your own view of the mind-brain relation, and then also just summarize the current state of the art as regards the hemisphere hypothesis in neurological medicine and in neuroscience, going back to Roger Sperry, who won a Nobel Prize for some of this work, and his student, Michael Gazzaniga, who I know is less excited about the way that you have unpacked the hemisphere hypothesis, and just give us a sense for what the general feeling is among neuroscientists about this hemisphere division.
Yes, yes. Well, needless to say, although I'm an admirer of Gazzaniga for having done the work he has done, I'm less excited by his way of understanding it, which is effectively entirely mechanistic. In fact, the moment at which one knows this, that he's not so excited, is when he was interviewed for a film about my work called The Divided Brain. And he says, look, the brain is a machine, get over it. Which is quick, but not what I call deep. And it's part of what I think is wrong. The matter with things is an oblique reference to a number of things, that we're getting it wrong, that we're obsessed with matter at the expense of anything beyond the fundamentally material. And we're obsessed also with things, because I argue that in fact things are secondary to relationships. I would say, the spirit of Whitehead, that I argue that in fact relations are primary and the relata are secondary. Anyway, you asked me a number of questions there. To deal with the last one first, I think a lot of people are increasingly expressing interest in the hypothesis. When I wrote the Master's Embassy, a number of big hitters came out and said that this was extremely interesting, including Ramachandran and Howard Gardner and Louis Sass and a number of other people in the area, and were very kind about it indeed. And also Colvin Trevarthen, who worked in Sperry's lab, as did Mike Gazzaniga, and who considers it extremely important work. So it's one of those things in science, you don't expect everyone to go, oh, yes, how stupid, we didn't see that. But you do hope that over a period of time, people will gravitate towards a certain position, and I'm seeing that happening very much. To go to the first of your questions, which is one I had imagined we'd come on to considerably later, the relationship between the mind and the brain. In simple terms, I see the possibilities for the relationship between the mind and the brain as that the brain might emit consciousness, which to me is the least likely, although the popular one in reductionist materialist science. It could transmit consciousness, which has got a lot more going for it. My preferred option is that it permits consciousness, by which I mean it sculpts greater consciousness into my individual consciousness. And I often quote here a wonderful image of William James, that he says, my voice comes from the air in my lungs coming out of my mouth. But if it weren't for the larynx obstructing the flow of the air, I wouldn't actually have a voice at all. So I see it in that sort of a way. Now, the intermediate question was, I think, really about, was it not something like, can you give us the elevator pitch on the hemisphere hypothesis? I think that was what you were basically saying.
Yes.
If not, correct me. But I mean, doing it very quickly, and if any viewer or listener has not seen a cartoon, which I very much opposed being made, that was made by the Royal Society of Arts in London after I gave a lecture early on following the publication of The Master and His Emissary, I was entirely wrong to oppose it. It's been very well understood and very well liked, and has had certainly over 2 million, I think more hits. So if you want to see a 10-minute, if people want 10 minutes to find out what I'm on about, that's the thing to do if you search RSA animate. But effectively, in evolutionary history, all organisms that we know have asymmetrical neural networks, even before there are brains. So the oldest organism we know, 700 million years old, Nemesis stellavectensis, has a neural net, which is the ancestor of our brain, that is already asymmetrical. Why? Our brains are asymmetrical. Why? They are also profoundly divided. why. Why are all the brains that we know of profoundly divided? In fact, the main connection between the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum, is a mammalian invention. Until that point, birds, reptiles, and so on don't have this relatively large connection. But even in that relatively large connection, only 2% of fibers actually cross the corpus callosum, and much of the traffic is inhibitory in effect rather than excitatory. It may be initially technically excitatory neurons, but its effect is to tell very often the other hemisphere, I'm dealing with this, you keep out of it. So there's something very interesting going here. And my hypothesis, no a better one, and nobody suggested that I'm wrong, is that all animals have to solve a fundamental conundrum at the basis of continued existence, which is how to get and grab accurately and quickly in order to get food, to pick up a twig, to build a nest. In other words, to manipulate the world. And for that, you need a particular kind of attention, which is very, very narrow, about 3 degrees out of the 360, very particular, enormously sharply focused to a detail. And at the same time, keep a lookout for everything else that's going on in the world at the time that you're grabbing and getting, which includes everything, like the predator, like your mate, like your offspring, like your obligations to the social group in which you stand. And so, effectively, all creatures seem to have this division of the hemispheres, in which one, in our case the left, pays this narrow beam attention to a detail solely for the purpose of getting. And the right hemisphere pays a quite opposite attention, which is broad, sustained, vigilant, and open to whatever it may find, not preoccupied by a particular thing that it needs. And these two types of attention, this is really the point, give rise to two different phenomenological worlds. This is why it is a philosophical concern. If it's true that each hemisphere pays different attention, it's going to see different things, and it's going to see them in a different way. And effectively what you get is two versions of the world. One, which is useful merely from the point of view of manipulation, shows a number of details, little fragments that are isolated, static, familiar, unconnected from their context, disembodied, effectively cut off from considerations of morality and other values, and abstract in nature, categorical in nature, and inanimate, effectively. So you have an inanimate world which is like a machine. It's a bureaucrat's dream, effectively. The right hemisphere, meanwhile, gives rise to a world in which nothing is ever completely cut off from anything else, in which things are never completely certain or fully known, are interconnected with one another and flowing and changing rather than static and isolated, are always to be seen in context if they're to be understood, involved with our embodied selves, not just with an abstract form of cognitive function, and are unique in nature, not just instances of a category. And this is an animate world and effectively resistant to bureaucratic reduction. In fact, it's a bureaucrat's nightmare. So these are completely different kinds of world, and we experience and know both. But very often in public discourse these days we favour the one, the left hemisphere one, because it's very easy to articulate in language, whereas the other one that sees a much more complex and beautiful picture in which sometimes opposites coincide is much harder to articulate. It also involves articulating the implicit. The right hemisphere alone understands implicit meaning, such as is in metaphor, in poetry, in jokes, whereas the left hemisphere understands the explicit and doesn't get what is not made explicit. So you can see that there's going to be crossed wires and crossed purposes when people view the world in different ways. And so before going any further on the path towards what can we call more real than anything else, because I just want to dissociate myself from the idea that I am going to come up with the nature of reality. Of course, I'm not going to do no such thing. But I guess we all believe some things are truer than others, and I want to get as close to that truth as possible. Before going into epistemology and then into ontology, I wanted to start by looking at the ways these hemispheres work.
Fantastic. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Just to give folks who are not quite as familiar with your work yet a sense for this hemisphere division and how it might affect our consciousness of the world. In the documentary made on your first book, The Divided Brain, there's a segment on education and a discussion about the way our modern educational approach is to rush children into the cultivation of the left hemisphere, basically, where childhood up until the time that schooling begins is obviously more of a right hemisphere type of world where there's a lot of imitation going on and emotional connection to things, stories, and whatnot. And this rush to cultivate the left hemisphere seems to produce a type of human being that is atrophied in a way, or only maybe a hyper-developed left and a underdeveloped right, unless you go into the arts. But the arts are often considered, increasingly so, kind of extra. And so this is still something you cover in your first book, but obviously you deepen this discussion in your second book, that in some ways our culture in the modern West has been captured by the left hemisphere, by its view of reality and what's important. Talk to us a bit about how and why this happened, and also, can you say whether you view this as just a wrong turn or an unfortunate mistake that we should fix as quickly as possible, or might there be some other evolutionary or even a spiritual purpose? And here I think of something like the Felix Culpa doctrine in Augustine, where in some sense the fall allowed for a greater good to emerge later. Is there something like that going on in this seeming detour into the left hemisphere's alienating and clockwork universe, or was it just a mistake?
Well, as you know, I don't actually call it the Felix Culpa, but I do talk about for Fallon and the necessity to see the failings of one particular point of view in order to move correct an overreach. But I think what I need to say right away, to summarize 400 pages, which is the first part of the book, I show an enormous amount both of clinical research, but also vignettes of patients, which I think speak volumes of what happens when the right hemisphere is damaged and the individual has to rely only on the left hemisphere. And the overall outcome of this is that the right hemisphere is less in touch with reality. Its attention is poorer, its perception is poorer, its judgments are much more fallible and likely to be jumpings to conclusions or frank delusions. So most really gross delusions and hallucinations in neuropsychiatry, and I've studied them for many years, both as an academic and as a clinician, are due to damage to the right hemisphere, not to the left. It's also more intelligent, both in the sense of, as you might imagine, emotional and social intelligence, but interestingly, the right hemisphere is also more cognitive intelligence, good old-fashioned IQ, and is also more creative in its ability to put data together to understand the bigger picture. So one thing which the left hemisphere is easily superior at is anything to do with grasping. It controls the right hand, and while language is subserved, as is reason, and everything else that we used to say were just one hemisphere or the other, all that, forget it. That's all rubbish because both hemispheres are involved in both. But what the left hemisphere does, particularly, is spoken language. And which is not the same as all language. The understanding of language depends highly on the right hemisphere, the expression on the left. And the use of the right hand to manipulate tools, to make machines, and so on. So the left hemisphere has a huge attraction to us as the means of getting, grabbing, and becoming powerful. That is, in fact, its raison d'etre. And one of the things I want to do in the book is to compare values. I use Max Scheler's pyramid of values. Max Scheler, in my view, a very underrated philosopher, but I imagine where you work, Matt, not so underrated at all. And really, effectively, it's only the lowest level of Max Scheler's pyramid that the left hemisphere accesses, which is utility and pleasure, and everything else to do with the so-called Lebenswerte, the geistige Werte, and das Heilige, all the things that really make us special as human beings, and elevate us, are due to the right hemisphere, and it alone seems to appreciate them fully. So it's a very bad thing when, if you like, with a capital B and a T, when a civilization starts only to attend to what the left hemisphere says. And in the second part of my first book, The Master and His Hemisphere, I look at European history since the ancient Greeks forwards to the modern and postmodern era, which I know is a fairly large undertaking. Tell me about it, but I did the best I could. And the first part of the book is on philosophy and neurology, and the second part is this history of ideas. And I think what I show there is that in the past, certainly twice, in the history of the civilization of ancient Greece and in the civilization of Rome, we see the same thing, that for perhaps about 300 or 400 years, there was a relatively fruitful working together, it might be shorter than that, working together of these two drives, complementing one another. And may I just, in an aside, scotch right away, please put out of your mind any idea that the left hemisphere does science and maths and so on, and the right hemisphere does, I don't know, paintings and things like this. It isn't like this at all. The right hemisphere is involved extraordinarily importantly in everything, including particularly scientific discoveries and the discoveries in maths. The fullness of all kinds of thinking began 6th century BC in Athens and then began to fade. And the same thing happened around the year dot in Rome, the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire, and gradually moved towards a more ossified, bureaucratic, hierarchical, static, controlled way of being, in which all the more living, animate elements that had been so incredibly rich and imaginative were, relatively speaking, fading. And I believe I can see the same thing in our civilization, with the comparable periods being the early Renaissance and even the High Renaissance, as a wonderful working together in every sphere of human endeavour to produce an extraordinary period of inventive, creative thinking and doing. And then since the Enlightenment, which is a movement, of course, which I have enormous respect for, there has been, unfortunately, a hubristic tendency to imagine we know everything and we can control everything, which is really the left hemisphere's way of thinking about things. And it's leading us, I think, into a dead end. In fact, I think it is likely to destroy our civilization. So I don't actually think that, no, Matt, it's not a good idea for us to sit back and go, oh, well, you know, the right hemisphere will have its day. If humanity survives this next crash, which is an open question, it will take some time for the right hemisphere to be bringing back any kind of a civilization. Last time it took nearly 1,000 years.
So I appreciate, as I lead into my next question, your important nuance, or even more than a nuance, just in the way that you bring the hemisphere hypothesis to bear on our social and cultural situation today. That it's one of the reasons it fell out of favor with scientists is that it got popularized into this very simple, left brain is science, right brain is spirituality and art and whatever. And what you've done in your work is show very clearly that both hemispheres are involved in everything, but in different ways, right? And so
Exactly. Exactly.
keeping that in mind, my next question for you has to do with science. You have a lot of important things to say about the nature of scientific truth, your love of science, the importance of science and scientific research, and also the role that science plays in society and the formation of public policy. I should mention in this context that the sociologist of science, Bruno Latour, recently passed away. His examination of science, kind of as an anthropologist, is very influential for me. I'm not sure if you've been exposed to or familiar with his work, Iain, but
Not so much.
can you speak to your sense of what's gone wrong with institutionalized science? Because it seems that with culture more generally, there's been a bit of a left hemisphere takeover, at least among some scientists. Although, as you point out, in physics over the last century, there's been almost a complete demolition of a sort of reductionist, materialist approach. While at least in the middle of the last century, biology became increasingly reductionistic, molecular biology in particular, though biologists are starting to
Yes,
come around too. But still,
they are. They are.
institutionalized science seems to have been captured a bit by the left hemisphere. Can you speak to that?
Mm, mm. Yes. I mean, first, I should just say briefly that what you're doing here is moving to the epistemology part two of this book, in which I look at what I consider the four main paths that we can use to approach truth. And I take those to be science, reason, intuition, and imagination. Imagination having slightly different status in that it's more important than any of the other three and is on a lower or more foundational level, or if you like, a higher level. In other words, none of them can function properly without the imagination, which I distinguish radically from fantasy in a well-known distinction made by Schelling and later made popular in English by Coleridge. So I look at the proper claims to being able to lead us to truth, and it falls to somebody like myself who is a great admirer of all my life and lover of science and a great lover of reason, and who actually thinks that the most worrying signs at the moment, apart from environmental collapse, are voices that now decry science and now decry reason. So I am enormously keen to defend them. But I think that if you're a true friend of them, you don't make overreaching claims. So I look at what the proper limits of science are. I believe there are things that you cannot ask science to address and questions that should not expect science to give you an answer to. Um, and I look at, as you say, biology and what's happened there and why it is wrong to think of organisms as machines. I look at, I think, substantively about 8 ways in which they're nothing like machines, and look at the paradoxes that occur when you try to talk about them as machines. What is happening is that science is unveiling the paucity of information that could possibly support a Dawkins-like vision that genes run the show and that we are the lumbering robots doing the bidding of the genes. It is almost as impossibly wrong as you can imagine. Genes are actually some of the most passive proteins in the body, and they form a store which the cell actively decisions about what needs to be done draws. So it's rather like a larder into which you can go and find the food you need at a certain point. But the food in the larder doesn't run your life, or shouldn't. So I look at the various ways in which the part-whole relationship and the the difference between an effectively static view of the cosmos, which moves only when something special is added and causes something to be set in motion, with the view that everything actually flows, and that nothing is ever wholly static, that it can only ever asymptotically approach stasis. So I look at all that, and in the doing of it, I found many voices that were sympathetic, such as Michael Levin, James Shapiro, but going back further to people like Barbara McClintock, who won a Nobel Prize, after all, in the 80s or 90s of the last century, and many others who have seen, if we go back far enough, we go back to the wonderful Haldane, Père et Fils, particularly probably JBS Haldane, and Conrad Howell Waddington, as well as Ludwig von Werther-Landfi. So there's a long history there that, as you say, got eclipsed in the middle of the 19th century, and is now coming to the fore and gathering strength. I was reading a book today about the debacle of Rupert Sheldrake's being banned by TED and the fallout from that, and what has happened to the rabid debunking materialists, and how they have really done themselves no favours at all, and people are not listening to this kind of unthought out and unsubstantiated attack on things that require a bit more subtle thinking. So that is good news. But then we come on to the institution of science, as you say, and in recent years that's become a very important topic for all of us. What did we believe, and were we right to believe it? And I think that, like everything else, science has its left hemisphere aspects and its right hemisphere aspects. Its right hemisphere aspects are those in which it thinks flexibly, thinks often in imagery rather than in sequences of either words or symbols, has the capacity to see things alter with a gestalt shift rather than simply by one piece of data having a knock-on effect on another piece of data, and so on. And when you look at the great discoveries and the accounts of them by the scientists and mathematicians involved, they all more or less take the form of a period of pedestrian work followed by a fallow period, after which there was a sudden revelation, an aha moment, which is very strongly related to activity in the right, particularly superior temporal gyrus and sulcus, but in any case in the right hemisphere. And similarly, of course, one could say about reason that it has its left hemisphere and its right hemisphere aspects. Its left hemisphere aspects are trying to make it equal a series of coded instructions that could be carried out by a machine, whereas true human reason is the product of a life well lived, in which one brings together wisdom from experience with the ability to use logic. It's not a cut and dried thing. So I think that's the problem, is that now, for various reasons, we've moved into the sort of empire of science. And if you like to think about the downfalls of civilizations as they become more and more left hemispheric, one of the reasons is that they overextend themselves, either geographically, militarily, economically, or in whatever way, and find themselves having to administer very large areas using reductionist ways, because we roll out, as they say, a certain way of thinking and doing which is uniform. And unfortunately, most important, interesting discoveries in science are not made by colossal amounts of money being put into enormously sensitive hierarchical organizations where people have duties to follow the family route, as it were. When Rutherford first described the structure of the atom, there was one author on the paper, Rutherford. When the Higgs boson was thought to have been discovered, the two papers that published this had over 1,000 authors each. Now, they did make that discovery, But actually, what happens is when you have, and this has been demonstrated by looking at scientific research, when it depends on enormous numbers of people agreeing and working in this way, it is not as imaginative as it is if there are one, two, or three people working in a fairly close-knit way, often with rather small budgets. And so we're prizing the wrong kind of thing, and we're advertising science as a mechanical thing that if you just follow scientific method, you'll come to a result. And even George Gaylord Simpson, one of the founders of the so-called modern synthesis, and therefore as mainstream as you can possibly get, said the thing about the scientific method is it's almost never been used by scientists to reach a conclusion.
Yes, well said. I'm reminded of Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts, whose work we study
Yes,
in PCC, in the sense in which there's normal science, which is just sort of continuing using the same abstractions to refine and improve the present understanding, the present paradigm. And then revolutionary science, when, as it were, I think you would say that a new gestalt is brought forth by some imaginative vision that a scientist has, that then includes more of the data into one overarching theoretical
exactly.
vision. And we've reached a stage in at least institutionalized, professionalized science where it's in a way too risky financially. Science takes money and
Yeah,
investment, right?
exactly.
To pursue new paradigms when you've already got a paradigm that works seemingly well enough, right? So there's more risk aversion,
That's it.
perhaps, especially when you have these
Yes, and
large
your
teams of
career
scientists.
Yes, your career won't flourish if you step out of line and don't honour the boss, as it were, and it's particularly to try and take on a wholly new conception is probably career death. In fact, very kind people at the Maudsley who had my interest at heart said to me, Don't go into researching hemisphere difference. Nobody will take you seriously. You've got a promising career ahead of you. Why do this?" But actually, I already knew so much about why this was philosophically interesting and scientifically robust that I took the risk. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One is very short. Erwin Chargaff, a very great scientist who paved the way for Crick and Watson, wrote an autobiography called Heraclitean Fire, which I'm sure you know, but if people don't, it's the best examination of this difference that you describe between pedestrian workaday science and great science and what he would call true science. And the other is just to say that, mention en passant, that I do spend some time looking at the ridiculous pronouncements of institutional science and the corruptness of the science process. I won't say any more about it other than to say that the idea that somehow peer review works in a non-corrupt way to select the best science, um, how shall I put it, is optimistic in the extreme, and that things that are picked up by papers and published are not often properly reviewed or scrutinized, that who wrote them makes a huge difference, all the corrupt things you would imagine, squashing something because you're working on it yourself, all the shenanigans that go on with real human beings happen in science, and some of it is utterly hilarious, I must say.
Yeah. So, to be fair, I want to also let institutional religion have it too, but we'll get there in a second.
Okay.
I want to just drill in a bit on the sciences. Your chapter, I think it's chapter 12 on the sciences of life. It's just marvelous. You've mentioned a few of the figures you're drawing on. Michael Levin, a contemporary biologist at Tufts University, is doing amazing work on what he calls bioelectricity. Very innovative, imaginative work. But you mentioned Waddington and Bertalanffy, Robert Rosen, figures who were all more or less influenced by Alfred North Whitehead, who, along
Exactly.
with Schelling and Bergson and William James, are very important figures for you in articulating a more integrative worldview and approach to the sciences. And I wonder what your sense of the current understanding of the place of life in the universe is. I mean, I've read your book, so I have some sense of that. But
Mm,
for our listeners today, there's a sense in which biologists are presupposing as a foundation for their science, the study of organisms, a kind of
mm,
meaningless, mechanistic
mm,
background that maybe 150 years ago was what physics was suggesting, but
mm,
physics has moved on from that. But even among biologists who have some understanding of self-organization and complexity and whatnot, they're still a bit resistant to the idea of purpose being more than just a kind of survival mechanism or something
mm,
that is not, as it were, disclosed by the universe, but just kind of epiphenomenal and, of course, necessary for explaining
mm,
evolution at the level of biological
mm,
organisms, but doesn't go any deeper than that. And it leaves us as human beings in a situation where, you know, we can't claim that our values are anything more than sort of accidental evolutionary survival
mm.
strategies, right? And so,
Yes, yes.
where would you like to see
Mm,
biology go in a more
mm.
balanced approach to science?
Well, it would be great if it could catch up 100 years later with physics. That would be a good start. And understand that as the right hemisphere indeed sees things, that things are interconnected, uncertain, non-fixable, contextually uh, sensitive, and dependent, and so forth. Um, Incidentally, and just to make sure that nobody thinks I could possibly not be insane, I adopt Rosen's view that animacy is the primary condition from which inanimacy is an interesting departure. Um, and in fact, what I would say about that particular question is that all the things that we think of as happening in life happen to some degree in the world that we call the inanimate world. I don't see a very sharp. I see the question of being and non-being as and consciousness and non-consciousness. Certainly, if you're going to claim that matter has no vestige of consciousness, or whatever, I do see this as hard and fast um, barriers, and that therefore consciousness cannot arrive from matter if you define matter as having no consciousness whatsoever. And there is no such thing as existence appearing out of non-being. But I do think it's possible for life to emerge out of inanimate life, and indeed, according to the conventional story, that is indeed what happened. But I see it slightly differently, in that all the things that living things, or a very large number of them that they do, happen in any case in the inanimate world, but they happen in a over a time span which is billions of times longer, and they are much, much, much less responsive or reverberative or reactive or whatever you like to call it. But I see whatever exists as existing in an encounter, and that everything is a two-way encounter, at least. It's never just one thing affects another. And so I say what we see as real is an encounter between my consciousness and whatever there else is, and that my consciousness affects what that is, and that encounter affects me and what I become. So I see everything like this, but I see that what life did was two things above all. One is it speeded up the processes, um, as I say, billionfold, so that in a single cell things can happen in the twinkling of an eye that in an inanimate situation would take billions of years to occur. And it also enormously expands this important element of responsiveness. And I think actually the reason, if you like, to put it this way, and I do think the cosmos is reasonable. I think it is, if you insist on draining all meaning out of it and not seeing its complexity and its richness and its intelligence and its consciousness, in my view, then of course you've got a hard problem. All this rubbish banging about with no meaning and so on. Well, you'll never derive anything important from that. I agree, but it doesn't look like that to me. I'm reading at the moment Jude Currivan's in pre-publication. Very kindly, she gave me her book to read, and her account of the evolution of the pre-animate cosmos is absolutely extraordinary and demonstrates, if anything could possibly demonstrate, and I believe it certainly can, this sense of a drive in the cosmos towards certain things, towards complexity, towards individuation, towards an unfolding of something that is present already in the cosmos. And I see life as just being this on speed, if you like. Life is this in a much more wonderful and extraordinary, to a much more extraordinary degree. And after all, why? I think this is a point that Whitehead himself made. If evolution is really all about survival, then why did we not remain at a very much more primitive level of evolution? In fact, we've evolved to being rather transitory beings who do very poorly in the stakes of persistence in being. And I think he said amusingly that the secret of persisting in being is not to live at all, which is true. But there are living beings, actinobacteria, at the bottom of the ocean, which are in some cases single specimens are 1 million years or more old. So it's not been about persistence. It's about achieving something that can only be achieved by much more complex beings. And I think it's absurd when one looks at the processes of life, but even when one looks at the processes, as Jude Currivan does, of the inanimate cosmos, to say that there is no purpose here. I'm not saying it's the purpose of a simple kind that we do. So what's the purpose of a photocopier? It's to produce a copy of whatever paper you put in it. That is the left hemisphere's idea of purpose, utility. But I'm not saying that purpose is utility at all. The purpose may be to bring about the extraordinarily beautiful, complex, rich individuation that is the cosmos, that is the universe, as has been seen in all the wisdom traditions. I can see no evidence against this and lots of evidence for it when one looks at the processes of life. So I certainly don't claim that there's an engineering God sorting things out and driving things towards an end. Not a bit. I'm opposed to that. That is a left hemisphere's idea of a God, a technician, an engineer who sets a machine going, but it's not a machine, and there isn't a technician for it. It's a something that is genuinely free, and its purpose is to unfold itself. I have a lot more to say about it, as you know. But
Yes.
That's really just to answer that. And as you know, Haldane made the wisecrack that every biologist has, purpose as his mistress, the person that it knows and loves, but can't be seen within public. So, I think that is the reality. We have to say that a turtle comes on shore and lays its eggs, not that it comes on shore to lay its eggs. But when you see single-celled organisms acting purposively in response to a stimulus that they could not be prepared for, either by their personal history or by the history of the species, so lab-engineered by human beings, and watch them intelligently respond to it, the idea that they have no purposes in what they're doing becomes ridiculous.
Yes. Well said. Completely agree.
I'm sorry, I talked for a very long time there, but can I just add one remark and then I'll hand over to you? It is that you mentioned values in general, and because we may not have time to go there, I'm comforted by the fact that my next door neighbour, literally at All Souls College in Oxford, where I was a fellow, was Derek Parfit, who was not known for his theism. And he said that values are ontological primitives, as I believe consciousness is. They can't be derived. I don't think we invent them. I think we discover them or fail to discover them, and the point of existing is to respond to them and to have that experience of celebration. So, sorry, now I hand back to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, on that point, I love this line from this word. I'm going to forget the German, but you reference Max Schleyer, who has this term translated as valueception, the perception of value,
Yes.
which very much reminds me.
Wertnehmung. That's it. Yes.
One more time,
Yes. Wertnehmung,
right? Which is
value taking.
value
Nehmen is
taking,
to take, and Wert is value.
right?
And it's a pun or a variation on Wahrnehmung, which is perception in German, the
Right.
taking of what is true. And he was saying we don't do, it's like color. He said value is like color. We don't sort of derive blue from anything else. It's a primary fact. And he said values were like that.
Yeah, and it very much reminds me of Whitehead's neologism prehension, in that Whitehead says we have no right to deface the value experience, which is the very essence of the universe. And so,
Wow. Yes.
deep agreement there. But it seems to me that perhaps this left hemisphere way of compartmentalizing the universe into, say, matter and life and mind or consciousness creates all sorts of difficulties for scientists or philosophers who are trying to do cosmology, which is, as we would understand it in PCC, an attempt to understand how these various levels hang together as a whole. And as you're saying, there's clearly a reason to distinguish inanimate matter, the physical world, from the biological world, which is evolving at quite a clip relative to the physical world. Though if you look at the history of the universe, at least as best we can
Yes.
understand it, there's a similar type of evolution underway, from
There
plasma
is.
to simple atoms to stars and galaxies and so on. And you need second
Indeed.
generation stars, to have heavier elements and so on. And so it seems to me we need a general theory of evolution. It's one of the ways I've been trying to describe it, that would bridge the gaps between matter and life and mind. Because if you can't conceive of evolution at this cosmological scale, it seems you run into, there are many scientists who are of a more reductionistic bent who have this curious self-forgetfulness where they say, that we're nothing more than machines. Gazzaniga, for example, evolved, with the values that we have because they helped our ancestors
Yes.
survive or whatever. And there's a forgetfulness of the fact that for you to claim this knowledge, science must be accessing some truth about the universe. But how could that have
Exactly.
evolved in a mere machine? And
Exactly.
so there's a lack of an awareness of the, as Kant might say, the conditions of possibility for even doing science in the
Yes.
first place. And I see your work
Yes.
as a very helpful and important reminder that we need to include ourselves in the universe that we
Yes.
are trying to
Yes.
understand.
Yes. Yes, if it's all random and determined, then the view that it's random and determined is random and determined.
Mm-hmm.
And it undercuts itself. But as has often been pointed out, um, scientists tend to exempt themselves from the strictures they impose on everyone else
Mm-hmm.
in formulating these positions.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that is part of the problem.
So let me tease out something here that I think is an important subtlety in your work, because I mentioned Kant, who brilliantly articulated these, as he called them, transcendental conditions of possibility of knowledge and experience. But he sort of puts the human subject at the center of the universe. It's his famous
Yes.
Copernican revolution in
Yes.
philosophy, putting the human back at the center, and has us inhabiting a merely apparent world, and says we can't know what the
I
world is
know.
in itself. We know how our mind organizes the world. But Schelling, as a student of Kant, kind of inverts this picture and says, well, rather than say, rather than ask the question, what must mind be such that nature could appear to us in the way that it does as a mere appearance?
Exactly.
Schelling says, oh, what must nature be such that mind could have emerged out of it? And that seems to me to be
Yeah.
more the sort of question that you're inviting us to ask,
Yes.
um, because
Yes.
you're not an idealist as I read you.
No.
You
No.
want that you believe in the real world out there, and that you
Yes.
think nature is perhaps, as you were saying, more more intelligent than the materialist does, and that in some ways our intelligence is an expression and an amplification of something
It is.
latent in nature, right? So
Yes.
speak about how your view is different from, say, a standard form of idealism.
Yes. Well, just a comment because it follows on. It seems to me that intelligence is a remarkably intelligent idea for the cosmos to have had, if you see what I mean, and that it suggests that there is something intelligent at the core of the cosmos. Um, in fact, all the amazing things that we have been able to achieve come only out of what there is in the cosmos. They can't have come anywhere from anywhere else. But what I would disagree about in idealism is I try to avoid the term either I'm an idealist or I'm not an idealist, or that I'm a naive realist, which I clearly am not.
Mm-hmm.
I believe there is something that we can call real, which is comes, as I say, out of an encounter. It comes out of the encounter of the only reality that I can know, that you can know, is the reality that we know, and that opens us to the suggestion that it might be entirely subjective. But I don't accept that. I think, I mean, starting from the simplest things, that there are obvious, very great commonalities in experience, or at least we feel that there must be. And I believe, unlike Kant, that we do contact whatever that is. The part the two ways of thinking about the partial nature of our knowledge, or the nature of our knowledge altogether. One might be we can only go so far to the limits of what is projected by our minds, and then we cannot cross that to whatever is real behind it. We cannot know that. Another is to say we can cross to that, but each of us can only perceive what it is we can perceive. So this is different in that the partial nature of the knowledge is not that we get some of the way but no further. The partial nature is we go all the way, but because we're limited by who we are, we only see the bit that we can see. And I sometimes use the image of the Japanese Zen garden Ryoanji because it has 15 stones in it. And from any one place in the garden, the most you can see is 14. And that's a sort of image. You do actually see the stones, but you don't see all the stones. So that's really what I believe. And I think that's what Whitehead, I mean, not in those terms maybe, but I don't think that Whitehead believed that we were in a sort of a blinded chamber that had no windows on the world, and all we could know was the projections of our mind inside that room.
That's right. So we're almost at the top of the hour. So for everyone who's been listening in, start to think of your questions. But I want to finish up our conversation, Ian, by talking a bit about religion. I mentioned earlier, after we took institutionalized science to task, that we should also spread the love, deal
Absolutely.
with institutional religion. You're obviously quite open, to the esoteric and contemplative and mystical aspects of the world's religious and spiritual traditions, and indigenous traditions included. And but there are powerful strains of fundamentalism that continue to wield political power in places like Iran, which is in the news again of
Yes.
late, but also here in the U.S. So what's gone wrong here? What leads to this fundamentalist, dogmatic form of religion, despite the fact that all the world's religions have these deep strains of contemplative and mystical insight that are so important for the world to pay heed to right now?
Well, of course, it would be very odd if everything didn't have its left hemisphere version and its right hemisphere version. In fact, it follows from what I've been saying that this must be the case. And you would expect the left hemisphere take on religion to aggrandize the individual, offer certainty, preferably something that's verbalizable in language, that has laws, that if you depart from these laws, you are an outcast, that only this point of view is right, that there are no nuances here, but things are either right or wrong, and that there is no room in this for subtlety of thinking, for poetry, for dance, for music, for all the things that actually convey meaning. The great myths, which are in essence doing exactly all those things. They're right hemisphere. They must be understood implicitly. If reduced to a simple verbal message, then you've lost the myth. They are taken as scientific truths. And of course, it would be very odd if atheism wasn't also left hemisphere and right hemisphere. So there are right hemisphere atheists who I think are enormously honourable people who say, I just don't know and I can't tell and we just don't have enough to go on. And I can't disagree really with that as a point of view. It's not actually mine, but it's a very reasonable point of view. But you get atheists who are just the mirror image of the fundamentalist religions. They've got it in their book. They know all the rules. They've got the answers. Anybody who isn't Jerry Coyne is a complete idiot. And this sort of thing. Well, it's terrible. And, the division is not between theists and atheists. It's between left hemisphere fundamentalist atheists and theists on the one hand, who really it's very hard to fit a razor blade between them, and those who use the whole of their minds, their intelligence, their imagination to contact things that are not easily put in language, maybe better contacted through, as they have always for me been, through music, through poetry, through myth, through community, through place, through architecture indeed, and above all through nature. So these things have spoken to me of something beyond the reductionist and materialist all my life, and it's what I call the sense of the sacred. And it's the title of the very last substantive chapter before the epilogue, which wraps up where we are now, in this new book, The Matter with Things. And it's a short book in itself. It's over 100 pages long. And it's the most difficult thing I ever wrote, because I wanted to be honourable and true to the various points of view and not flippant or dismissive, but to try to show where things were going wrong.
You say in that final chapter on the sacred that panentheism seems to be the most reasonable articulation of the nature of the divine, with the admission that it's
To
a kind
me,
of,
yes.
to you, right? But it's a kind of left hemisphere. All theology is a kind of left hemisphere way of trying to articulate right hemisphere intuitions. But you also
Yes.
discuss process theology, and it's kind of a home base for me. And I wonder if you could just say briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions. What is it that draws you to this vision of a Whiteheadian God, which is both in the world and the world in God? Why is it a compelling vision of the divine for you?
Well, I can tell you exactly why. It's because I believe both in a process philosophy of the world and therefore of the divine, and I believed in this idea of the world and God being in it and the world being in God, since my teens, long before I'd ever picked up a volume of Whitehead. So when I discovered Whitehead, it was the biggest homecoming you can imagine. I had something of the same when I discovered Bergson, and something of the same when I discovered Schelling. There were people who struggled to say, and actually in the case of, not in the case of Schelling, but in the case, in the case of Bergson and Who else was I
Whitehead.
mentioning? Sorry. Well,
Whitehead.
yes,
Yeah.
and no, Henry. Sorry, William James.
James.
They managed to do it very well. I mean, I love Whitehead, but my only complaint with Whitehead is that his use of language is sometimes a bit of a barrier. But
Hmm.
there we go.
Hmm. Hmm.
But anyway, no. When I first at school, we read Plato, and then I discovered the pre-Socratics, which nobody actually mentioned in class, but people were talking about them, my colleagues, and I discovered Heraclitus. And as soon as I discovered Heraclitus, I thought, my God, this man knew so much more than Plato. And then I discovered Taoism through Alan Watts a little bit later, a couple of years later, about 18 or 19. And I thought, gosh, this is the same sort of a philosophy. And so all my life I have believed that it's a mistake to see things as sort of static objects that have to be assembled to make any meaning. But instead I have seen a constantly flowing web in which everything ultimately is connected to everything else. And this idea that God, I mean, what is so wonderful about Whitehead's idea of God and his world, his universe, is that God is coming into being at the same time that the world is, and that the coming into being of the world is enriching God in the same way that obviously God is enormously enriching the world. So this is a process, almost like the intertwined double helix, in which they come together and create and bring out of one another aspects that were folded in, implicate, and are now being made sort of really unfolded into the actual phenomenal world. So that's inarticulate, and if I had to write it, I would take every word there and cross it out. But I just burbled something that gives you some idea of what I'm thinking there.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate it, Ian. I'm gonna stop being selfish now and share you with others. Let me just unpin us and unpin myself here and open it up. And invite whoever would like to ask a question to either wave your hand in your little square or raise it. There you go. Sean knows how to do it. Um, Go ahead, Sean.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Ian. That was so rich. I was particularly moved by your encapsulation of evolution, relationship to life and consciousness. Very moved by that. If you bear with me, I have it's a one question, but I want to set it up here. Matt, you used the expression, I think I've heard you do it too, Ian, captured by the left hemisphere. And obviously it's a metaphor, but I'm wondering to what extent that expression and that way of thinking is metonymical or something much more complex. So this is, and here I want to bring in. I'm wondering if you're aware of the research of a Japanese brain researcher, Tsunoda. Apparently, some studies in '82 and '85 showing that for Japanese brains, or that is people raised in Japan speaking Japanese, they don't have to be genetically
No.
Japanese, that language as well as animal sounds and music are actually lateralized on the left, in contrast to people, even genetically Japanese people, raised in the United States, let's say. And apparently this is due to the predominance of vowels in the Japanese language. In other words, there's a cultural linguistic imprinting, which seems to be causally related to the to brain lateralization in terms of language and many of the things that you're talking about. So there's
When you
that.
said left, sorry,
Yes.
but please continue. But when you said left, did you really
Mhm.
mean left?
Well, this is what I was reading now. So apparently,
Because that is the norm in the West. Is that at any rate, speech is largely lateralized to the left, music to the right, animal sounds possibly to the right. But I understood you to say that this was all much more left-driven in this picture, which is
people,
possible. Yes.
in people raised in
But,
Japan, apparently music and I'm not sure which aspects of language, but music certainly, animal sounds and other things which
yes. Okay.
for,
Yes. Yes.
for the typical Western raised person,
Yes. Yes.
which would be lateralized to the right, are actually lateralized to the left for people raised in Japan. So this suggests to me a complex relationship between brain, culture, and we could even bring in obviously just individual psyche. And we, if we have a depth model of the psyche, we bring in the depth psyche, the archetypal dimension. So when we say captured by the left hemisphere, I think it's important to realize we're speaking metonymically to avoid a kind of subtle reductionism. This is which I'm sure, I hear you avoiding that on many occasions, but I'm also a little wary of the power of this, of the power of this phrase captured by the left hemisphere, that people can forget that the situation is actually a lot more complex. And this leads to, this will be the last part. Relations as primary, things as derivative. Surely this must include the relationship between relations and things. So if relations are primary, then presumably the relationship between, let's say, left and right, which I take as a metonym for a much broader, more complex archetypal situation, that relationship is actually what's primary rather than, you see what I mean? So I'm also wary of collapsing the complexity of relationality into the left. So I'll just pause here, see what you have to say about that.
Well, that was a comparably rich question. Thank you very much. And unfortunately, you've just disappeared. But maybe you intended that. But it would be nice to be able to talk to you.
I'm still here. Sorry, it's just the speaker view.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, yes. So you are. You've moved about. Very reasonable. Now, well, let me start at the end. So I definitely think that what is embodied in the left hemisphere and in the right, if one likes to think in those terms, is a product of a relationship. I mean, they don't pre-exist and get instantiated in those hemispheres. What is worked out is a division of labor, if you like. What works well is that one part doesn't get involved in certain kinds of ways of apprehending the world or comprehending the world, because if it does so, it will interfere with and negate the process that is going on in the other hemisphere. So they are a product of their own relationship. And then I would probably go to the first part, because what you were really saying is capture makes it sound like there's a drive. I think that's probably what you were saying. It makes it sound like there's a sort of, no?
Well, no, I was more,
anyway.
It was not so much the capture, but captured by the left hemisphere. So it's just whenever I hear
I see. Okay, yes.
Standing in for something much more complex.
Well, it is. It's standing in for a whole way of thinking that is extraordinarily much exemplified. I mean, although they are effectively, as you say, metaphoric, the fact is, I have been researching this for 30 years, and there are 5,600 references in the Matter with Things to do probably more than that, but those are the papers that are referred to, which support extraordinary. I mean, of course, everything in science is approximate, and particularly in life, but there is no question about it that the left hemisphere does adopt pretty much all the things I'm talking about more than the right, and the right does adopt the things I'm talking about when I talk about the right hemisphere more. These are not just. This is a problem I have with people, that once they've decided that it's metaphorical, then why not just cut loose from the brain science? There are a number of reasons for that. Number one is that it's actually wonderfully instantiated in the brain, and the brain has evolved like this, presumably for some good reason. So it's important to maintain that link without saying that in any one individual, all the things that are called left hemisphere are going on at this moment in that person in their left hemisphere. Of course, that would be wrong, and that would be a misunderstanding of how the brain works.
Sure. Yeah. No.
But
I wouldn't want to deny that. It was just that if this research about Japanese brains is
yes.
true,
No, I was coming on to
then,
that. No, I'm about to come on to that. Don't worry. No, no. So I do know a bit about, obviously, language in Chinese and Japanese in the brain. And interestingly, in some respects, it is more left hemisphere orientated than in Westerners. And that's why I wanted to check what this person had said, whether it was consonant with what I have heard. What made me think it probably... Yes, the thing that probably made... Sorry, the thing that I think probably made me think it wasn't consonant, if I can confusingly use that word, is that you mentioned the vowels. And one of the reasons that the left hemisphere is thought to be better at hearing human speech is because it involves the discrimination of consonants. So little sort of little almost machine-like sounds, whereas the vowels are better right hemisphere appreciated. So I found that a confusing finding, if that's right. So the next thing I would say is that the difficulty with doing this kind of research is that you don't know that necessarily the left hemisphere of somebody who is brought up in the Japanese culture is going to function in the way that it does in someone brought up in the Western culture. And this bedevils research in schizophrenics, because I researched asymmetries in the brain at Johns Hopkins in schizophrenic subjects. And there are reversals of the normal asymmetry. There's a normal functional asymmetry in the brain, which is reversed in schizophrenia or absent. And therefore, when you see the right hemisphere of a schizophrenic subject activated, you don't know whether that is, as it were, their right hemisphere or something that's a hybrid or something more like a left hemisphere. So the difficulty of going too far out with brain imaging is that it doesn't allow for that kind of difference. Sorry, you wanted to come back to me.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I won't say any more because I don't want to hog the space, but this is fascinating what you're saying. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, rich question and exchange. Thanks, Sean. I'm just going to go in the order of the hands that are appearing on my screen. I think Layla, you're next. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Go ahead and unmute. There you go.
Hi, Matt. No, it's perfect, Layla. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Ian. First of all, I'm just very excited to be here. I was in PCC, and then this semester I moved over into somatic psychology, and we just started reading your book. So when I saw this talk, I'm still very new. I won't pretend to know more than I do.
No.
But I'm just very grateful, very excited. So thank you. I guess I've been doing my own kind of independent studies and pondering research on my experiences and things that I've seen. I come from a background in international development and humanitarian aid overseas. And I work specifically with children in crisis situations. And doing that, I not just experienced, but witnessed a lot of trauma and a lot of just lack of humanity. I guess in reading your book and getting more into this, into neuroscience and psychology and anthropology and philosophy, everything together, it just to me seems like there's been this disconnect of humans from nature and their sense of humanity, sense of feeling and having empathy and compassion. And I wanted to know if the whole right left brain structure and system and way of flowing together had anything to do with that, which I'm sure it does, but how? Because my intention and motivation in the work that I'm doing and what I'm studying right now is to find effective solutions to address, I would say, the root cause of problems. coming from different perspectives, whether it's psychological, political, social. And I'm trying to find what is the root. To me, it seems like it all comes down to human psychology, us not really understanding ourselves, not growing up in societies which teach us to understand what it means to be human, what it means to connect to one another, especially here. It's very, more on the materialistic side of things. And I mean, I've seen the problems that this causes. Seems like people are just walking around very robotic and blind. And, it's painful to see, but I'm also trying to see, okay, well, what can be done about it, and especially with the younger generations, and especially with children.
Sure.
So yeah, I guess that's where I'm coming from, and it's just I'm curious to see how your work can kind of tie into that.
Yes, well, it's never a good idea to read the ending of a thriller, but if you want you want to, in this case, go to the last chapter, I talk about how this plays out in our society. And to cut a long story short, I think a lot of the ways in which we're now trained to think, and certainly big organizations think, whatever they window dress as, are deeply rooted in this mechanistic, materialistic way of thinking, which is uncreative, often lacking in empathy, certainly lacking in subtlety, often ends up with black and white and either or solutions, which are very rarely going to be the answer, and ignores what is implicit and so forth. So the work you're doing is incredibly valuable, and being able to bring a different kind of mentality to it seems to me very important. You won't be surprised to hear me say that obviously education has a big part to play in this, and that what exactly you say, we don't understand our humanity. We used to study something called the humanities, the whole idea of which was that nobody would leave school a mere technician, but would have been submerged in a history of at least their own culture properly and bits that come from other people's cultures, so that they understood philosophy, history, what it meant, and what made in literature, which is one of the ways in which, before becoming a psychiatrist, I was a literary scholar. And people said, "Oh, what a huge jump!" Well, studying medicine was, but actually the two things are actually a passion for working out what human beings are like, what motivates them, and the things they do is part of that whole picture. So I think that education is very important. I think that spreading a point of view. So once one has internalized a different vision, and a lot of readers tell me that after reading my books, they feel they see the world differently. They can pass on, I hope, in this world in which people use sound bites to degrade one another. They're aggressive, they attack, they misrepresent, they use I'm right, you're wrong tactics, they use black and white thinking, and they don't show compassion. That really we need to show compassion for people we disagree with, try to see their point of view and what motivates them, and help them to see things that we think are important, and perhaps at least get to a point where they say, yeah, there might be something in that, because at the moment everything's too cut and dried. And it has to be measurable or it doesn't exist. I quote in the book a report from the WHO, the World Health Organization, on a program in Africa to eliminate a parasite that's common in rivers, which causes a condition called onchocerciasis, which leads to blindness in children. And they evaluated what they'd got in terms of value for money. And at the end they say, and of course it will no doubt have improved the quality of life for many young Africans, but because they don't earn anything, there's no way of evaluating it in our project, so we haven't. There we go. But thank you very much for your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Layla. Let's go next to Dana, is it?
Dana.
Dana.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear. Go
Okay,
ahead.
great. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this amazing information. My question might be very left brain, but I'm wondering, in all of the movement of everything that's happening here, how would you describe the process of thinking? I mean, do we think up everything we think, or does thinking just happen?
That's a very good question. The short answer is that thinking covers an enormous range of types of experience. So sometimes we use it to refer to things that are explicitly going through our minds right now, but we know that that's not more than 0.5% of all that our body, our mind, our brain is aware of and is taking into account. Is that thinking? I don't know. The German 18th century scientist and philosopher and essayist Georg Lichtenberg said that we ought to say es denkt, it thinks, not I think. That to me seems too much like something exterior that I'm not acknowledging. So I prefer it thinks in the field of me. So in the field of my experience, there is thinking going on, some of which I consciously originate and monitor, some of which I don't consciously originate and monitor. But it's all happening in the field of me. It's all mine. I own it all. It's not being done by some spooky other thing. So that's what I'd say about that. And further, I would just comment, because it's a vast question on which I could have written another 2,000-page book. I'm so glad for everybody's sake that I didn't. But how to separate thinking from feeling, from intuition, from imagination, from all the rest that I count as part of the ways in which we encounter reality. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, we could have spent an hour just deepening into the significance of that question. But I loved your answer, Iain. I was thinking exactly of that sentence, that it thinks in the field of me, which is one of my favorites from your book.
Okay.
Next is Rick Tarnas. Rick, go ahead.
Hello, Rick.
Hi, good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Very nice to see you.
And to hear your literate voice, crossing the bridge there to unite the sciences and the humanities, as we all feel that commitment here as well. I have a fairly thank you very much for visiting our community here, our philosophy, cosmology, consciousness community, and we've been looking forward to this, and I know a lot of other people will be watching this afterwards. I have a short question. It's a kind of meta question, and that is, you have made a discovery, and worked very hard to articulate it and ground it in research, and you're bringing forth into the world a kind of gestalt shift, in the terms that you were talking about before, and it's a new idea. It's a new way of framing our approach to things. And that's kind of what we're in the business of doing in this program. In general, we are very focused on worldviews, on ideas, on original ideas that can transform a worldview, that can transform make a difference, basically. But the big challenge is how do we translate new ideas, new paradigms, new gestalt shifts, such as what you're bringing forth, into practices that are enacted in a society, in our society, perhaps in our civilization more generally. How do we do that? How do we bring our new, moral orders, our new paradigms and visions of what is into practices? And I wondered, in your own life, how you have been conceived, because you care for the state of the world. It's obviously in a fraught, even catastrophic state. How are you making the bridge between, or do you have ideas about how to bring your particular conception into practical transformational efficacy in the world?
Well, thank you, Rick. And I like very much, and I hope it's true, the idea that I might be trying to effect, or even succeeding in effecting something of a paradigm shift. I think, what can I say? There are two things really. Those things that we can do individually, which involve questioning and pushing back against practices that seem to lead into a greater grasp or capture by the left hemisphere, where we see them in our own field in which we work, by embodying a different way of thinking in the way we pass on to others what we can. That's all each of us does. We talk, we model something for others, I hope, I suppose. And then there are bigger projects to do with, I mean, largely they've got to be to do with education if we're talking about changing the minds of the future. And education is in a powerless state at the moment. So it really, really needs rethinking what we're trying to do when we're educating somebody. We're not trying to stuff information in. And any educational system that runs a course in which there are 6 things that you must say about Jane Austen, otherwise you don't get 100%, has completely misunderstood the nature of literature and of the experience of reading it and what the imagination is for and what an education is for. And it's absolutely disgraceful. So we do have, I'm sorry, I'm a bit passionate about that because I do think we're poisoning or corrupting and de-skilling the minds of children by turning them into something more robotic. And actually the way people talk nowadays and go about in the world seems to be more zombie-like often, I mean literally. And so I want to see people recapture something of the life, the imagination, the joie de vivre, particularly among young people, that I don't think I'm wrong in remembering used to be around years ago when we were growing up. It seems now it's a horribly punitive world in which if you step out of line, you become a miserable non-person, life becomes unbearable. And we've got to stop doing this and start being more liberal about what people can say and giving them a hearing and sort of trying to get together to solve the world's problems, not fighting and infighting with one another. I mean, sorry, it's not very helpful to say these things, but I just think it's clearly true. I just don't have a formula for it, Rick, and you're probably not surprised that I don't. But, those are the things I think we need to do.
Thank you, Iain. Education is a very good place to consider putting into practice that will have transformational effects. I mean, I think of how much Rudolf Steiner, for example, thought about,
yes,
having Waldorf education, with how crucial that was and how crucial it's turned out to be. Okay, I thank you for that and pass it on to the next person. And great to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rick. Next up, Iain, it is about four past half the hour. Are you okay to stay on for a few more questions?
I can do a couple more questions, yeah.
Okay, great. I think Josh, you are next. Go ahead and unmute. There you go.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for taking my question. So before I became a philosopher, I was trained as a psychiatrist and a neurophysiologist and practiced psychiatry for about 10 years.
Wonderful.
And my specialty, or my subspecialty actually, was psychotic disorders. I actually had a sort of referral base for patients with schizophrenia and psychotic depression, things like that. And since coming into philosophy, I've always realized that especially psychotic disorders like schizophrenia really give an insight into the differences between a healthy, functioning, conscious connection with reality and one that is not so healthy. And I realized that schizophrenia, it's an intercultural phenomenon, but it's also controversial, and especially in the United States, is way overdiagnosed. And that may even get worse now that the DSM-5 has gotten rid of the subtypes of schizophrenia as well. I don't know, that remains to be seen. With that said, I realize that it's controversial. I also realize that brain imaging studies are difficult for some of the reasons that you mentioned in schizophrenia, because the neuronal architecture at the cellular level is so trying to think of a good word, disorganized. So I'm wondering if, and admittedly, I haven't read your book, but I'm wondering if you could speak to your research in, say, more stable ways of analyzing neuronal architecture in schizophrenia that might have hemispheric differences, say in postmortem analysis of neuronal architecture. Do you find that there are differences from hemisphere to hemisphere, or is that even being studied in truly confirmed cases that are sort of undeniably schizophrenic?
I think it is. And some of that evidence, chapter 9 of my new book, the end of part 1, is called What Schizophrenia and Autism Can Tell Us. And I'm looking very much at phenomenology, but I also do look at neuroanatomy, neuropathology, neurophysiology, and the differences from the typical normal situation in those conditions, which are also in themselves various. As you say, there are different kinds of schizophrenia, and I believe there are autisms as well as autism. For example, some people with autism are hyperverbal and can't see things in other ways. Something has happened to the screen. I don't know whether to pay any attention. Can you still hear me? Oh, yes, it's come back. Can you still hear me?
That.
Yes, yeah,
Yes, we
no.
can.
Okay, hyperverbal, and some like Temple Grandin, who acts as a spokesperson for people with autism, says she was amazed when she discovered that people thought in words. That was a very odd thing to be doing. How did they do that? Anyway, to cut a long story short, yes, I think one can. But what I find absolutely fascinating is at the phenomenological level. And this has been studied mainly in literature that has not been translated into English by mainly French and German psychiatrists, neurologists, and neuropsychiatrists between about 1890 and 1950. And I've gone into that literature in depth and drawn it and translated, because it isn't translated in many cases, in the new book. So even if you only wanted to look at chapter 9 of The Matter with Things, I'm sure you'd find an enormous amount in it that would be of interest, because actually it's the whole world that changes in schizophrenia, above all the sense of time, which is not often talked about, but this has been seen by many people of a philosophical cast of mind who know about mental illness as at the core of the psychopathology of schizophrenia. So it's a massively interesting topic. But thank you for putting me on to that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Great question, Josh. So we have 2 more hands up. And I just ask to keep your questions short because it's getting late into the evening for Iain. So with that in mind, I'll invite Carol next to unmute. Go ahead, Carol.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Iain. So, Iain, I've only read about 600 pages of The Matter with Things. I deeply appreciate your articulation of left brain, right brain contributions to our sense of worldview. And I particularly appreciated your section on the nature of truth. That was very meaningful to me. Now, I have neither an advanced question nor a meta question. Maybe on Rick Tarnas's question, I could say, hey, Rick, I've discovered that it's kind of a nice spiritual practice to wonder if I'm being in my left brain when I'm talking with people. That's kind of an interesting practice to contemplate. But I have 2 very direct simple questions, and I'm hoping that I misread your text on both of these points. This comes out of my feminist self and feminist concerns. I believe you made one brief comment that women are less intelligent, and also another brief comment that women are less often in their right brains. Please tell me I misunderstood, or please help me understand what you were referring to.
I certainly would never have said women are less intelligent. I have no idea where you get that from. I haven't the slightest clue, because I did never say that. It is certainly true that there are disproportionately more neurons in the male brain, but we know that neuronal count isn't, it doesn't follow directly that means greater intelligence. So I didn't offer an opinion on that. What I did, and again, it's not an opinion, it's simply a report of all the evidence, that when the male and female brains differ in the way or which parts of the brain are used to address a certain kind of life situation, and there are robust differences, in almost every case I know, in fact, I dare to say in every case I know, when they differ, the man is using the right hemisphere and the woman is using the left hemisphere. Now, don't shoot the messenger. I'm simply telling you what I've researched the literature, and this is what it shows. Quite what it means, I don't know. But I come back to my answer about the Oriental brain, that maybe a woman's left hemisphere is not so left hemispheric, if you like. And there's some evidence that there's more overlap between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere in women than there is in men, so that they're more differentiated in men, less differentiated in women. Now, the difficulty there is that being more differentiated has its advantages, and being less differentiated has its advantages. Being less differentiated has this advantage, that you can, if there is damage, you can compensate more easily by using the other hemisphere, because it's already, as it were, primed to go. That's a very crude way of putting it, so don't quote me, but there's more overlap. There's more what we call redundancy in the system. In males, there's less redundancy, which means that they're much more vulnerable to neurodevelopmental disorders. And if there's damage, they'll affect 4 times more neurodevelopmental disorders in boys than girls. And this is because the brain is more specialized. So their right hemisphere is more right hemispheric, and their left is more left hemispheric than in the case with women. And that has its advantages. It means that certain, particular skills are often more highly developed and are found, at the end of the distribution, more in males than females. But at the bottom end, they're also found more in men than women. Maybe that's what you're picking up on. That the shape of the bell curve is different in men and in women. The ends are pushed further out for men, so there are more perhaps geniuses, but there are also more people who are in fact very low functioning.
Thank you.
I'm just reporting what there is.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. This reminds me that decades ago I learned, and this may have changed in terms of scientific studies, that women have, and you may have commented on this in the book and I'm just not recalling, but the women have more of a crossover in the corpus callosum. And maybe I learned that as a psychology major 100 years ago. But I also remember decades ago when my children were young, that Newsweek had an article that referred to intelligence tests showing males as scoring higher, partly because of the speed of their brain processing. And as a young mother with young children, I remember contemplating that and thinking, well, for women who have to spend a lot of time with young children, we have to do a lot of time brain crossovering, trying to interpret children's language and so forth, and figuring out what's important to them. And so I thought, there must be some kind of bias in the study. Yeah. So I'd love to hear your comment on that.
Nature has its reasons for doing these things. And I must say that when there were 3 children under the age of 5 in the house, for several years, I felt like my brain had been put through a blender. I mean, I was incapable of writing anything coherent.
Thanks very much, Carol and Ian, for that interesting exploration of these brain differences. We have one more question from Yogi, and then we'll wrap up. But before Yogi unmutes, I just want to ask everyone who has shared a question or a comment, let me know if you do not want to be included in the recording when I put it up on YouTube. So either drop me a comment in the chat or email me. I just put my email in the chat. All right. With that, Yogi, you can bring us home.
Thanks so much, Matt and CIIS for putting this together. Ian, it's a real pleasure. I got to meet you in East Anglia many years ago with the environmental philosophers, and now since the publication of your last tome, the rabbit hole just keeps on going deeper.
Okay.
As the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Biosemiotics, we often work with with Charles Sanders Peirce, Gregory Bateson, this notion of teleology. And as was mentioned earlier with this question or this framing of it is thinking, through me or in my ambit, there seems to be this constant tension between agency on the behalf of not just humans, but of any possible agent, and being moved. And this seems to be not just something that humans have a hard time with. You could say phenomenologically, in the West, as you so eloquently described, there's this tendency towards being regarded as a self-made, especially man, or as being an individual, as opposed to being part of a collective or emerging. And I wondered how much you think these sort of human conundrums, which we face as a planetary civilization currently, or hopefully emerging planetary civilization, also permeate in the more than human world. That is, this tension between moving and being moved.
What a good question. Well, there should be a connection purely etymologically between motion and emotion, and there is. And this brings us to the question of the relationship between the mind and the body, and emotion and action in the world are the ways in which our embodied selves are expressed and discover what they know. So I was very taken with the research by a Hungarian marine biologist, and I can't remember his name. I wouldn't be able to pronounce it properly in any case, but who has found that there are certain sea creatures that are thought not to have any perception, but they have motion in the sense of cilia of a kind that move. And with this, they are able to get food and so forth. I mean, how we know that they have no perception is, I think, an interesting philosophical question. So I slightly doubt it. But I think that it's a point that's been made by a number of people that our perceptions come from interaction with the world. It's a very important perception or idea that they are related in that way. And that thought emerges from feeling. I mean, this isn't a discovery by Damasio, although he shows that it seems to be the case. It's a discovery that was known about as far back as Pascal and Vauvenargues in the 18th century in France. And, it's emotion out of which we learnt to practice cognition, to think in a less emotive way. So these things, motion, emotion, and cognition, are massively interconnected in the body and in the brain and in experience. So I think if they are that way for us, they surely are for other living creatures. And the evidence seems to be that they are, of all the ones we can observe. So I'm no doubt that you're 100% right about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What wonderful questions. I could do this all day, but Iain, we'll let you go. This has been enriching and enlivening, and for those who are frightened by the length of the 2-volume book that you've written, as you say in your intro, don't consider it another thing to add to your busy lives, but just begin reading it, and you will find a friend, an intellectual friendship blossom. At least I certainly have, and would have even if we didn't meet in person, Iain. So thank you for your contribution for us here today, and for your book and the work that you continue to do. You're certainly a friend of PCC, so you're welcome back anytime.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much for arranging this and making it all happen. So, and for your enthusiasm. And thank you all for coming and for your questions. I'm sorry I didn't have time to speak with everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, Iain. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Iain.
Enjoy your Sunday.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, Iain.
You.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.